we're talking about extracting data from Slack, because there's a lot of interesting data in there that we might want to look at. And we're not revealing some vulnerability with Slack. We're just going to talk about using an API. We'll release a tool for pulling down all messages and files and other useful information from Slack using their API. And that's a tool that you'll be able to use. And then we'll also talk about how you might be able to detect this being used in your environment, maybe to notice that someone's account has been compromised. And that's the part that Tony will cover. OK, so I'm Carrie Roberts. Yeah, thank you. This is going to be fun. I'm a red teamer for Walmart, and I used to be a developer. And I really started out in security after miserably failing a pen test with my web app. I knew nothing about security at the time, and it inspired me to learn something about security. So now I'm a red teamer, and I also, to learn about security, I got the SANS master's degree, and that was a great help to me.
I'm Tony Habeger. I come from a really varied background. I've owned a business, worked in networking, security, data loss prevention, HIPAA compliance with hospitals, so medical information systems. I'm currently working as an incident responder with Walmart.
Okay, and just the little disclaimers. This isn't an endorsement for any product or service, and these views are our own. We're not officially representing Walmart here, so they may or may not agree. Okay, just quick intro for those who don't use Slack. Slack is kind of like a way to chat, share files. It makes it really easy to communicate, especially maybe if you're remote, not right in the office with someone. So here we have an example of like me sending a message to Martin, and we've got over on the left we have our channels that we can talk in, and there's public channels shown with the hashtag there, and private channels that only if you've been invited to, you can talk to people in that private channel. And then there's also direct messages where it's one-on-one, you talk to someone else, or actually it can be more than one-on-one. You can talk to multiple people, other people directly. They call that multi-party instant messaging. But those are the 4 different types of channels, and you'll see that terminology throughout this presentation, so I wanted to point that out. But one important thing to note here is up in the URL is this like CCE number. That's the channel ID. Every channel has an ID, and that's good to know for when you interpret the output of this script. So Slack is widely used. There's 50,000 teams paying to use the Slack service. Last year they announced they have 6 million daily users. 43% of the largest 100 companies in the nation are using it, and 55% of those daily users are outside the United States. So this just gives you an idea that this, if you're a pen tester, you're likely to bump into this at a company you test, and so this might be of interest to you. We find a lot of sensitive information in Slack. It's just so easy to share information via Slack. And companies may say, well, we have a policy against sharing sensitive information in Slack. Well, that policy doesn't get adhered to as well as you might hope. When people, by golly, they just want to tell this guy what the password is, and this is just an easy way to do it. Or they just want to post that file, or they don't realize sensitive information is in that file. So even with policies, you'll find a lot of sensitive information in Slack. Slack publishes an API, so a programmatic way to interface with Slack to get information. I've highlighted there the channel history call. If you make a call to channel history, you can fetch all the messages for a channel. So the script that I developed uses the Slack API. To use the Slack API, you have to be authenticated. And so on the website, it says to use the API, you need a token. And the token looks like that example there. It might be like X0, XS dash, and a bunch of numbers. You need that to be authorized to use the API. And you can get that token if you log in with your web browser. One of the responses that you get will have your token. And you can see there in orange down there a response that has the token there. So at that GitHub URL, that's my GitHub, CLR208/Slack extract, you can find this script which you can use. And the README has just these 3 simple instructions. To use the script, You start up PowerShell with that command. You import the module, and then to learn how to use it, you can just say get help for the script, and it has lists out all the options and examples of how to use it. But we'll talk about that here too. So to use the Slack extract script, there's three required things you have to give it. You have to tell it the Slack URL. So in our examples today, we're going to use slackextract.slack.com. And then you have to give it an output folder name, so just a folder where you want all this extracted stuff to go. And then we'll use my extraction as the name of the folder for these demos. And then you need to give it either the cookie that your browser generates when you log in, and I call it the D cookie because Slack gives this cookie the name of D, just the letter D. So you either need to give it the D cookie because that can be exchanged for an API token, or you can just plain give it the API token. So one of those two things are required. So there's 3 minimum parameters that you use with the script. So the D cookie I mentioned you can get from your browser, and I've got a demo of that. But you can take the D cookie and make a call to Slack to the messages, so slack.com/messages. And in return, that response will contain your token. Again, this isn't a vulnerability. This is just how you authorize with the API. So how do we get the D cookie? We can look in our browser after we log in. So if we're using this, like, we're not pen testers, we just want to extract all of our own information because we want to search through the files that we put in there or the data for whatever reason. Or if we're a pen tester, a red teamer, we may have compromised someone's Slack credentials, and we might want to pull down all this information that they have. So if we log in as them, we grab their D cookie, and now we extract information as if we were them. So I do have some commands. You don't have to try to write this down. It's all in the GitHub wiki. But some examples of if the user had used Chrome to log into Slack, you could extract the D cookie with that long command line there. Or from Firefox, you can do that. Here's a demo of how to do it if you were to log in to, I'm going to call it the victim in this case, but to the person who you have creds for, log into Slack. So you go up to the ... menu and go to Settings. And you just search for cookies. That's the easiest way to find it. Scroll down to Content Settings, Cookies, and then see all cookies and site data. And then you can narrow it down by searching for slack.com. You see Slack there. And then you just want that cookie named D, the D cookie. So that big, long, ugly thing there, that's what you would like to get a hold of. So just copy that out to use with the script. OK, so here we have basic usage. We have our authorization token, or our D cookie, and we say invoke Slack extract. We give it the output folder name. We give it the Slack URL and our D cookie. And I have an ellipsis there in the middle of the D cookie because I don't want to paste that big, long D cookie in. But that would be that big, long D cookie there. And the example output, we see that inside our documents directory, Slack extract folder was created. Inside that Slack extract folder gets created your output folder. So we called it my extraction. So now we have this my extraction folder. Inside my extraction folder, there'll be a folder for every channel. So this is that CCE channel we saw earlier. Inside that folder is a folder full of files from that channel and a folder full of messages. So the files, we look over here, we see that it has each of the files in there. And then in the messages directory, we have a JSON file, one for every single message in that channel. And the JSON file looks like this in the lower right. It has a type of the message, the user who posted that message, the text of the message, and a timestamp. And the message files themselves are named according to that timestamp. So if you sort by the file name of the messages, you can read messages in time order. There's also metadata directory created. So inside my extraction is a metadata folder. So that's like information about the channels themselves. So each channel has a name, a topic, a purpose, whether it's public or private, previous names it used, created date, and even more than that. If we look inside the channels folder, we see there's a JSON file for every channel. So that has all those details we see on the right. But after it downloads all those channel details, it rolls those up for you into allchannels.csv so that you can open it up in Excel and you can quickly sort through all the channels, what their purpose is, and find channels of interest by looking at that CSV file. I said that if you run this, it'll download all files and messages that user has access to, which is mostly true, but there are some default limits just to help you keep from blowing up your disk space on your machine. So by default, it'll download up to 10,000 messages from each channel and up to 2,000 files, and there's some other limits there. But you can increase that to be enough to grab everything if you have room to do that on your system, or decrease it to get less from each channel. So here's an example of extracting user profiles. So this actually is my favorite thing to do very first, is to pull down all the users, because I'm always interested in getting a list of all users, because I really like to do password spraying. So maybe the way I got into Slack is I went onto LinkedIn, found out maybe these 300 people work for this company, and I did password spraying, but you know, that's not a lot of people to try to guess passwords for, but eventually I get one. And then I get one, get into Slack, and then if I download the user profiles, now I have the whole company. I have usernames for the whole company that I can use in that password spray. So now if I went from 300 to 3,000 people, my chances of guessing a password just went up 10 times. So I like to extract user profiles. And the way you do that is you just add this extract users switch. And when you're using this switch, it will not download files and messages. All it does is user profiles. So you can run this separately. And in this example, I changed the limit for max users to 1,000 from the default of 100,000, I think. So if we ran this inside our My Extraction folder metadata directory, there's a users folder. Inside there is the JSON file for each user. And you can see that on the left. You see details about the user. You see their display name, their phone number, their email address, their title, job title, if they've entered it in their profile. And then it also rolls that up into allUsers.csv. So you can open that up and see a nice sortable list of all the users, what their display name is, whether they're an admin. And also the display names often defaults to be their Active Directory username. So that, again, comes in really handy for password spraying, or can come in really handy. Another option is the private-only switch. So there's public channels, which anybody can talk in, and there's private channels, and you might suspect that some of the more juicy information gets shared in those private channels. And so in the interest of time, you might choose to only download all the private channel information. And private channels in this case includes those those private channels, which Slack calls groups, instant messages, direct messages between you and one other person, and also kind of the multi-party instant messages. And so all you do is you use the -private-only flag. And then I've got the ... on there just to remind you that you still have those 3 required parameters, which is your output folder name, your Slack URL, and either your token or your D-cookie that you need to have on there. You can specify specific channel IDs, so if you're only interested in certain channels, you can give a comma separated list of those channels that you're interested in and only pull data from those channels. On the flip of that, you can also exclude channels. So you could say, give me all the private channels except these 5 that I know are bot channels. So bot channels are like automated messages that come in maybe from servers. And those are super boring. I mean, you look for a little bit to see if it's posting passwords, and after that, there's like millions of messages, and it just clogs up your system. So you want to ignore those bot channels for the most part when you're looking for this sensitive information, and that gives you the option to do it. And then extracting access logs. So this is only an option if you have credentials for an admin of a paid workspace. So if this is the free workspace that Slack offers, you won't be able to do it. And if you don't have credentials for an admin, you won't be able to do it. But if you happen to have that, this is handy because you can download all the access logs, and inside each access log, again, is a JSON format, but it says the user, their display name, when they access the system from what IP, and what user agent. So now you know the IPs your users are coming from, and their user agent, which tells you information about what operating system they're using and what software they use on their system, which can help you do a targeted attack later. So that's good reconnaissance. What if I can't find the D cookie, or I've got access to a system, but it's not like a graphical user interface? It's like command line connection, maybe through a C2 session. You can also just look directly for the token. And I give 2 commands to do that, one for Mac and one for Windows, to pull out that token in places that it gets stored on those systems. I think it actually gets stored there if they're using the Slack app. I'm not positive this applies if they're using their browser only. But for the Slack app, you can find those tokens. Again, this is on GitHub. On the wiki portion, you can find these commands. So there's an example at the bottom where you can invoke Slack extract, and we give the Slack token here instead of the D cookie. Okay, so here we have a demo of all this put together. And didn't play. Okay, so on the right, we have our Slack extract workspace that we're logged into. There's a general channel, a public channel. In the public channel, there's like this picture of a carnival and this weird picture of a mask on a wand. In the random channel, there's a bluebird, a sticker sheet, and a pink unicorn. So we're going to run Slack extract script on this workspace. And the output is going to go to the ctemp directory. So we'll be watching over there for what shows up when we run this script. Okay, so here we have our command, invoke Slack extract. We give it our Slack URL, which for this example is slackextract.slack.com. Output folder name, again, is going to be my extraction. And we're using an optional parameter to tell it to write to ctemp instead of the documents directory. And then we give it our Slack token. There's several optional parameters that I'm not talking about in this demo, but if you run that get help, it will tell you what those extra options are. So we run this. And over here, we see the Slack extract folder show up, and inside of that is a my extraction folder. We start to see folders for every channel popping up, and those pop up, and they get filled with those JSON messages. So we look in the messages folder. There's every message. This is a small demo channel. And then we go into files. Files get downloaded very last, so it isn't until all the messages for all the channels get downloaded that gets downloaded. But we see our images there. We can go back. That was the random channel. We could go back to the files for the general channel, and we can see that this is a bigger file, so it's taking longer to download. But then we see the carnival image and the mask image. So now we have an offline copy of all that information. Now we're just going to add on the dash extract users, and we're going to pull all those user profiles. And that's already done because there's only 3 users. But if we go back and go into the meta folder, under users, we see the JSON file for each user and the CSV file that puts all those users together in one easy file for us. And we could get the title, phone number, if the users have entered it, their email, their image, their display name, etc. So back on that wiki, right now I have 2 wiki pages. I'll keep this updated with relevant information, but one is about authorization, so all those notes on how to get your D-cookie or token, and then some tips on analyzing your results after you've pulled everything down. So first is authorization, and this is straight from that slide, getting your D-cookie or getting your Slack token. And then analyzing the results. So when all these messages get written to file, they get written in default PowerShell output format, which is UTF-16. And I saw someone stick out their tongue and shake their head. They don't like that. You could change the script and make it write out in ASCII if you want, but I left that the default. But I give you some pointers on how to. So the problem with that is when you go, if you tried to grep through these files, for the word password. Even though the word password is in there, it won't find it because of the formatting difference. So I give some tips on basically how to grep using PowerShell for you. And so, for example, if you want to extract all the usernames, this is kind of the PowerShell version of grepping. So you could select string and select name, and that would give you all the names of all the users. Or you could do the email addresses. If you wanted to select the title and the name, you could do something command like that. And if you wanted to just write the usernames to a file, which is really handy for password spraying, you could use that command. And there's a little description at the end how that kind of search works there. So that's kind of useful. Okay, so the advantages of using Slack Extract are that you quickly get an offline copy of all the data that this user has access to. So if you were to lose access shortly after gaining it, at least you have that data available to you to still look through. Also, you can search through that data offline, which means anything, like if you're searching for certain sensitive words, the defenders won't see that. If you're just typing that into Slack search thing, they could potentially have alerts that say if people start searching for any of these keywords, like password and Amazon S3 keys and these things, alert us because that seems suspicious. So if you're doing that offline, you don't have to worry about those alerts. And you can do quicker and more powerful searches without going through the online version. So that brings us to the point where we have this great tool for basically reconnaissance using the Slack API. With credentials that we have. So now on the flip side, as defenders, we're interested in knowing that this is being used, because this definitely is going to have a different look and feel if you had access to the logs. You know, you've got somebody who just downloaded millions of messages, thousands of files, all in a short time frame, which humans could never go through the Slack API and right-click a file and say download that fast. So you know something's up, and maybe you could determine that this user's been compromised. And so I turn it over to Tony to talk about that portion.
Thank you, Carrie. That is great information, and we can't discount the fact that this script is good for Blue Team also, because we can go through, see what somebody can find, and then you know exactly how much sensitive data you have sitting out there. So detection, where to start? This was a overwhelming thing for us at first. We had to look at it and we're like, man, that's a lot of information that can be just pulled right out. We wanted to know what Carrie's script did. So we worked with Carrie. We looked through the script. We've learned the script. We run the script. Again, very useful for Blue Team also. And then we had to go back and learn our sources. We have an AuditLog API, which is documented in Slack. It's on their website. And then you have the other normal API methods, and it's listed under methods. There are a few other APIs that they use depending on what you're looking for, such as events. But once we looked at our APIs, we kind of knew what we were looking at. We needed to go back and decide what we wanted to do with the data. So we needed to decide, are we going to put it in a SIEM? Are we going to build a custom alerting module? What do we need to do? Everybody's going to be a little different depending on the size of your company. You may not have a SIEM, so you may have to build a custom alerting tool, which is where we started. Learn our sources. Each API has different formats. For the most part, the API AuditLog really tried to standardize how their output goes. The others, they change. Every now and then Slack will go through and be like, hey, we didn't have this column in our database, but we needed to add it, so we added it. So all of a sudden you're putting into a structured database and you have a new column you're not recording anymore. So we had to take that into account. In the AutoLog API, they try and break everything down into an action, an actor, an entity, and what context. So in these are logins. So our actor and our entity are the same exact information. If you're looking at files downloaded, the entity is actually going to be the file information, the name, what the file ID is in Slack, what type of file it was, when it was uploaded, that type of information. On the flip side, when we were looking at our standard API methods, if we're looking at the events for a user login, we've got something called date last. That's the last combination that the IP address, the user agent, and the username were logged in from. So they use a combination, as well as when the first time they saw it was. So rather than getting a, hey, this user logged in today, 50 times. They say, hey, we've seen this pattern once, and this is when we first saw it. So kind of the differences. AutoLog API does require you be an owner or an admin. It is designed for monitoring. That's kind of key when you're looking at this. And it separates the logs. Your login and your log off events are separate. Your file upload, download, they're separated. Standard and corporate exports. You have the ability to export some data depending on what level of Slack you have. So you can actually go through and monitor who's downloaded these, who's been joining channels, role changing. If you're looking for someone getting in and trying to elevate to an account, they may get another account, they may elevate it, you can monitor for that. On the flip side, if you only have access to the API logs, you're looking at any standard user can use it. As Carrie's demonstrated, you can use the D cookie or their token. It's designed for user interaction. It's not really designed for logging, so what you get back isn't really ideal for that. It's a lot less comprehensive. It doesn't contain separate files for who downloaded what. The file downloads aren't included. It does allow for login events and channels.history like Carrie was showing. It also allows for other similar API calls to be made. So that's something to be aware of also. So when we're calling the APIs, with the AuditLog API, which is where we primarily focused for our alerting, it uses what's called a bearer token, which we've all seen. You know, Facebook did a similar thing. They had that nice, wonderful little news article recently about those tokens. You have to call the bearer tokens. The AuditLog API uses one rather than a user. The bearer tokens can be really problematic to set up, and it's not just the first time you do it. You actually have to go through an authorization process through Slack, and you go through, you set up the API, you set up the token, you set up the basically, you're setting up a bot. You need to make sure you set plenty of time aside for this. You need to make sure that you're prepared with at least a contact at Slack, you know, have their email, their support email pulled up, ready to go, because there's a really good chance you're going to need to email them. And just be aware of the headache. Don't get stressed about it. Don't get upset about it. The first time you do it, and every other time, sometimes you just run into those brick walls. And probably the biggest problem for us was copy and paste. For whatever reason, and I've used PowerShell, I've used Python, I've typed out the string, user_logout, and I will compare it with a copy and paste directly off this website link right here, and they will be perfectly identical. And we'll pass it the API string, and it returns nothing, throws an error. We're like, what? And we can copy the string out, we can paste it in Notepad, we can paste it back in, and it works just fine. We have no idea why. So when you run into problems, try copy out, paste back in, see if it fixes it. It's weirdness, but we've seen it with multiple people in Python, in PowerShell, and directly in their web APIs. So calling the API in Python. We'll start with that one. That's kind of where we started. You're going to have your proxies if you're behind a proxy. Remember to include those. Your AuditLog API is not being called by your organization.slack. It's actually calling directly to api.slack.com/audit/v1/logs. That's important to note because when you pass the token, that's how it knows exactly what organization. It is not looking for you to pass the organization. We have different actions: user login, user logout, file upload, file download, exports. You'll be passing those. Each user, the limit, if you look, is 9999. That's the standard default, I believe, for their limit, but you can actually call less depending on how much you're populating. That's per page. The cursor, they use pagination. So at the bottom of the call, you're going to have a little pagination. You just pass that back, and you can keep cycling through. Every now and then, you're going to run into a weird issue where it's going to pass that pagination token like 3 or 4 times. So sometimes you have to go through and you have to watch what your code's doing, what it's returning, and make sure you're not getting any duplicates in your data. So the wonderful values are parameters. We can't pass the bearer token in right there. If you try and pass it, authorization, bearer space, and the token value, it's not going to work. It's going to throw an error. It will say not authorized. It will say user does not have permissions. You have to pass it as a separate. Pass it as a headers equal, works just fine. So we went through and also did this with PowerShell. You know, if we do it in one, let's do it in the other. That way you kind of have a good example. So again, very similar. We've got the proxy up there. We've got the API token. But inside, we actually built the headers. And this is very similar. I tried creating this in one line. It didn't work. We had to do the .add separate. It just would not take it otherwise. Again, we ran into the same authorization errors. So if you look, even in PowerShell, we get a status code 200. It comes back, and your content is actually where all of your entries are going to lie. And this is kind of what it looks like in your text document. You've got your same layout, your action, your entity, your context. Down at the bottom, your UA, IP address. So once we had the data and we were calling it, we had to know what we were going to do with it. Slack uses structured data, which is great for them. But whenever you're calling events, if they go through and add an extra column, we don't have that luxury. So when we were going through our data, we decided we're going to use Kibana and Python. Why not? A lot of people are using it. We're going to try something new. So we were like, hey, what are we going to do with our results? Well, we're going to pipe it into Elasticsearch, call it into Kibana, and then we're going to build a custom alerting module. Elasticsearch and Kibana were used. Elasticsearch, just because when they change data, we can keep piping into the same indexes. It's going to modify itself. It's still going to be in one index. We don't have to worry about it. Kibana was because we could very quickly see the visualizations, so we could very quickly analyze our data. Here's kind of a basic example. If you look, well, pretty much exactly what I just said, but the quick pattern review, that was really easy for us. Even if you look there, we can see, hey, that's kind of a weekend, and look, we had a holiday weekend. But we can take that quick flip into a visualization based off of count and very quickly see that one user was really hammering the file downloads. They downloaded a lot of files in that amount of time. So we were like, hey, how do we key off this? What's unique? We had to go back to our data and say, what's unique? Is the username unique? Is the user ID unique? Slack actually has a user ID field. That's the unique key. It doesn't matter how many emails they change. It doesn't matter how many usernames they change. That's not going to change. So we said, hey, that's one of our keys. So we looked, and this is in a 30-minute window. We had this user up here, downloaded 741 files. In 30 minutes, most people can't do that. I can't click that fast. So we started looking, hey, who is this user? We can see that the user was none other than Carrie Roberts. And she even tried changing her name. She even tried to make it really sneaky and make it compliance exports, which some users would be like, hey, that could be normal. The compliance exports downloading files. So we wanted to rotate through. That's kind of identify your data, know what's unique. Once we had that, we built a very basic alerting mechanism. This was nothing fancy. We literally just took Python and said, hey, email me every time you aggregate the same data. So I went through and I went, go aggregate the last X number of minutes, and I want to see this many file downloads within that time. Also, I want to exclude all of the stuff that I know for a fact is a false positive. As you go through your data, it's going to be different for everybody, but as you go through, you're going to see stuff that is plainly just going to be a false positive. It's something that's automated, it's something that's system, it's something from Slack. You're going to see it, you're going to be like, nope, need to exclude that. So that's what we did. We just passed it straight into an email module, and I just got a really basic email. Give me the user ID and how many files they downloaded. From there, I could very quickly just open up my Kibana interface, drop in the user ID, and say, hey, show me everything that this user did. Then we loop back through, and sure enough, it was Carrie Roberts throwing all those alerts. So automation is your friend. I really like to automate everything I can because I don't like going back and doing work over. It's important not to hard code your tokens. When you set up these APIs for AuditLog, you set it up, and one of the agreements in it is you will not hard code your token. Don't hard code it in your script. If, God forbid, somebody posts your script into your Slack or anywhere else, there's going to be your token. Just remember that. Rotate your tokens regularly. I mean, basic security. You've got a button. Yes, it's a long, drawn-out process. You can't automate the process. That's the problem. You cannot automate it. You actually physically have to log in, go to a page, pull a script or a part of a web URL out, go through a process just to get a returned value so you can pass it back and get the API token. It's kind of a hassle. Once you get the token set up the first time, though, it's pretty standard, and it didn't seem to fail. So, of course, automate what you can. We automated the download of all of the API data. So we'd pull it straight into a database. We'd push it into the database with automation. And then we automated the alerts. That allowed us more time to do the tuning. We knew what we could see as a true positive, what we could see as a false positive, and how to tune it quickly. So there were some real hurdles and struggles. Not all API calls are logged. The message downloads are not logged. File downloads are logged. That's something to be aware of. So even when we're looking at the alerting, we're limited on what we can see as a blue team. That's why it's important to know what the scripts do and how they can be used. Even run them against your system regularly, just so that you can see what sensitive information is out there. Optimize your data storage from the start. We did not do this the first time around, and in turn completely blew up our Elasticsearch a couple times. It's kind of fun. You may have to break your indexes down by date, depending on how much data you're running into. You may have to run dual databases, one that runs a shorter amount of time, say a week, and then you have long-term storage in another database. Just keep that in mind. Try and use some sort of data loss prevention. These tokens, some of them are flat-out keys to the castle. They can read anything. Your admins and your owners have more read privilege than anybody else. So if somebody gets a hold of that token, they can pipe it through the script and they can start pulling all your information down just like you're an admin or an owner. There are log discrepancies. This was the hardest one for us to wrap our head around. There are way more log out events than log in events. And I'm not talking like twice as many. We're talking 25 times as many log out events as log in. Be aware of that, because you may be looking at a number going, this is way off. Something's wrong with my script, and it may not be your script. It may just be a discrepancy. That is something that we passed along. We're like, hey, we see this discrepancy, and we did get some feedback on it. API rate limits. Slack actually documents their rate limits very well on their website. For API tokens, you have a rate limit of 50 per minute. We've, however, run into issues with this. It's not sure if it's a calculated rate limit or just a flat-out rate limit, but we have noticed that we have to put a larger timer in the more amount of data we're pulling. So, of course, with the logout events, I said they were much larger. We had to have a much larger delay between each of our API calls than we did, say, on the file downloads. That's, again, we're not sure exactly why that happened, but we did notice it. It's something you need to be aware of, because if your script starts failing and you may be going, hey, my code's wrong, try adjusting that timer, because you may just be hitting a rate limit. Watch for your, I believe it's your 429s is what they pass back. So are there any questions?
The question was, what's the worst thing that has been found, through running the script or, data in Slack? And we found the corporate Wi-Fi password, which was WPA2, so they shouldn't have been using that in the first place. But the corporate Wi-Fi password, the shared, here's where we put all of our important stuff on this shared drive. Here's the password that they were sharing. User passwords, S3 access keys, code. People put a lot of code on there, and the code often has credentials. Mostly what I look for is credentials, and the other interesting stuff that I look for that's not credentials is just, it's a great way to get a list of URLs that they use in the company, internal and external, like, oh, look, they use this third-party app and this third-party app. They probably have logins over there, and I could try to get into that. And they use this for shipping, and they use this for SAP. And so it's great recon that way. And also, there'll be a lot of internal URLs posted, like, here's our admin portal, which is only accessible on the internal network. So suddenly, you have a great list of, if you do get on their network, places to go of interest. Yeah, so his question was, so if I get a hold of somebody's cookie somehow, can I download everything they have access to, regardless of the fact that I'm not on their machine, coming from their IP on their network? And the answer is yes.
So the question is the sanitization. If you find a WAP2 password or any other credential inside of Slack, does sanitation actually take it out of just that channel or multiples? It depends. You actually have to go through and start looking for it and then finding where it's at, and your admins and owners are going to have to go through and manually delete it most of the time. There are APIs to go through and delete them, but again, you're going to have to know exactly what channel it is. If it's a private message, depending on the level of Slack you have, your owners, admins may not have access into that private message. That's important to know also. Sanitization can be a real task. I'll be totally honest. It can be very cumbersome to go through, and a lot of the time, it's a lot easier to go through and force a password change than try and sanitize just straight out. Okay, I believe the question was, can we do anything proactive to prevent this with Slack, correct? Well, you can put policies in place, but people don't always follow policies. That's just how it is. Unfortunately, because you're looking at a cloud provider, you're limited there. You can attempt to put some DLP in place to say, hey, if this stuff's going out, try and block it. Not all DLP solutions are going to be able to provide that. So you just, it's hard. You really have to monitor what's inside your Slack environment and do good sanitation by, of course, either using scripts or going through and using logs to start looking through your data, see what's out there. So the question was, what about a Slack bot to monitor for text, and then if you see something like password alert? That would probably be a good method. The thing you need to remember is if that token for that bot ever gets used or found out, they can then start exploiting that bot to start getting that data also. And that's something to be aware of. You're not just looking at your user tokens. You're looking at your user tokens, your bot tokens, your AuditLog API tokens. All of your tokens are a prime target. Some bots have more power. They'll have things like incoming or outgoing webhooks, so you can write into or write out of from Slack. And there may or may not be good alerting for that. So that's something to be aware of. Your tokens really can be the keys to your castle.
Yes, as a non-privileged user, will I be able to see the names of all the private channels that I'm not invited to? And no. So I think you're asking if like Blue Team were to find out that somebody put the corporate Wi-Fi password in Slack and went and talked to that user, how have they reacted?
Well, that can be a little bit touchy because the user, of course, is going to first say, hey, I probably didn't do that, or it was an accident. A lot of the time, as Blue Teams, as owners, as admins, we can go in, we can delete that message, depending, again, on our level of Slack. Then we have to push a change because, again, you don't know who's downloaded it, so you still need to rotate it. Treat it just as if it was completely compromised. It's just like any other password. If you treat it like it's been compromised, it's a cloud environment. If you don't know for 100% certain nobody's ever scraped your environment, then treat it like it's been compromised.
So real quick, and then I'll ask you about something to go back home and try if you use Slack is to type in the search password and just get an idea of how much is accessible even to you. And if you do it like password : but you need to put that in double quotes, so you're telling Slack, don't try to be smart and give me things like password. I want specifically password : then you'll find even more stuff quickly because people will do that password : and put the password. But question in the black here. The question is, what's the largest exfil I've done? Well, I assume I've done with the Slack extract. I've used it like in 3 campaigns so far, and I didn't look up how big it was. Well, it was about, the last time was about 10 gigs, and it ran through the night. It was done in the morning, so I'm not sure how many hours it took, but maybe 6 or 7 hours for 10 gigs. And I was using the default limit, so 10,000 messages per channel, 2,000 files per channel. Should we let you go? We kept you trapped long enough? Okay, you're welcome to come up and chat with us afterwards, but thanks for coming.